Hey everyone, Amio here from Crunch Time Sport. Today we're going to be looking at a preview of the second round matchup between the Toronto Raptors and the Boston Celtics. So somehow this is the first matchup in history between these two franchises. It may be the first one, but it's sure to be a great one. So when doing this breakdown, I'm going to be looking at a few things. The starters, the bench, X-Factor players in key matchups, and finally season stats between the two teams to get an idea of what these two teams are like. So let's start off by looking at who the likely starters will be for this series. So for the Toronto Raptors, you're pretty much expecting a standard starting lineup. You have Kyle Lowry and Fred VanVleet at the guard positions, OG Anunoby and Pascal Siakam at the wings, and at your center position you have Marc Gasol. The Boston Celtics, on the other hand, will probably have a little bit of a different lineup than expected, and that's primarily because of the injury to Gordon Hayward. Likely you'll see a 3-guard lineup with Kemba Walker, Jaylen Brown, and Marcus Smart starting at the guard spots, Jason Tatum as power forward, and rounding out with Daniel Theis as your center. Both starting lineups have a ton of grit defensively and also a lot of talent on the offensive end. Although the lineups are a little bit different, let's try to do a player-by-player comparison and see who has the advantage in the starting lineup. When looking at the primary point guard or ball handler, we're going to be comparing Kyle Lowry and Kemba Walker. Between the two, Kemba Walker is probably the more talented guard. However, Kyle Lowry, with his experience and much more capable defensive skills, is probably going to have the slight advantage here. Also add on to the fact that Kemba Walker seems to be dealing with what seems to be a slight knee injury. Kyle Lowry should have a little bit of an advantage here between the guard spots. Next, we'll look at the shooting guard position. The Toronto Raptors don't have a typical shooting guard in that sense, so we'll place Fred VanVleet, who plays the role of the second guard for the Raptors, into that position. For the Boston Celtics, again, because of the Gordon Hayward injury, we have two players who are kind of shooting guards. You have Jaylen Brown and Marcus Smart. For this comparison's sake, we'll put Marcus Smart as the primary shooting guard. Marcus Smart is one of the best defensive players in the entire NBA, one of the most overlooked in my opinion. Also, you have Fred VanVleet, who leads the league in deflections, so he's no slouch on defense either. When comparing the two offensively, Fred VanVleet clearly has the more expansive offensive game. He can dribble, he can shoot, he can get to the rim with ease. Marcus Smart, on the other hand, has struggled throughout his career to have a consistent three-point shot. But when he does get hot from three, he is lights out. Although I do want to give Marcus Smart the edge here because of his incredible defensive efforts. Again, like I said, he is one of the best defenders in the league. I'm going to give the Toronto Raptors a slight edge because Fred VanVleet still does play excellent defense. As I mentioned, he leads the league in deflections. So, slight edge here to the Toronto Raptors. Next, I'll look at our wings together. Between the two teams, we'll put Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby of the Toronto Raptors, and we'll compare them to Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum of the Boston Celtics. Pascal Siakam is Toronto's primary scorer. This year, he became an all-star, and the offense is often run through him. However, these playoffs, he's had a little bit of trouble finding his footing and often seems a little bit unsure or out of control. OG Anunoby is also a solid defender. However, his offensive game hasn't quite developed to where the Toronto Raptors probably wish it was. He lacks a consistent three-point shot, which is a little bit frustrating at times, so there's a lot of work to do for him there. For the Celtics wings, you have Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, both of whom can be 20 to 30-point scorers, maybe even more on any given night. Also, both players have extreme hustle. Jaylen Brown is happy to take on key defensive responsibilities, and Jason Tatum looks like a knockdown shooter from almost anywhere on the court right now. To me, there's no question here. The Celtics wings have a massive advantage here over the Toronto Raptors. When looking at the bigs, you have Marc Gasol and Daniel Theis. Now, between the two, it's pretty clear who has the advantage. It's clearly the Toronto Raptors. Marc Gasol is a former All-Star, former Defensive Player of the Year. Yes, he has lost a step in his later years in the NBA now. However, Daniel Theis really hasn't proven too much, and Marc Gasol should have a clear advantage, both scoring and on defense in this position. So the starters are pretty close between the two teams. But what about the bench? Because of the Gordon Hayward injury, which was really unfortunate in the first round, Marcus Smart has had to step up and insert himself into the starting lineup. At least that's what's projected. Because of that, Boston's lost their primary go-to scorer and go-to defender off the bench. On the other hand, the Toronto Raptors are a very deep team. With Serge Ibaka, Matt Thomas, Norman Powell, Terrence Davis all coming off the bench, it gives them many options, whether they want to score, play defense, go big, go small. A lot of options for Coach Nick Nurse to play with. Clear advantage here is the Toronto Raptors. When looking at the key matchup in this series, there's no question about it. It's Jason Tatum versus Pascal Siakam. Both players have emerged as real all-stars this year, and now they're going to have to prove to their team that they can lift them up into the next level. Another interesting matchup is going to be who's going to be guarding Fred VanVleet. The Raptors' guard is a critical piece to the Toronto offense, so I would expect to see Marcus Smart guarding him primarily, and then when you see switches, maybe Jaylen Brown taking him on. Both players are extremely good on the defensive end, and they're going to be looking to shut down Fred on the offensive end.
Toronto really relies on his three-point shots in momentum, and we'll see if he can carry this throughout the series against an excellent defensive team. My X-Factor player for the Toronto Raptors is going to be Terrence Davis. Now, Terrence Davis hasn't necessarily got the minutes in the first round that many would have expected him after his performance throughout the season, but in limited minutes, he still has performed. The reason I think Terrence Davis has a prime opportunity to really blossom as a player in this series is that Boston's bench is extremely shallow. With its hyper-aggressive style of getting to the hoop and being able to hit three-point shots, coupled with Boston's lack of defense on their bench, he should have an incredible opportunity to hit a lot of three-point shots and get to the free throw line very often. Add to the fact that Serge Ibaka and Norm Powell are also going to be attracting defenders away from him. It's a prime opportunity for him to show what he's got. So let's take a look at their season stats to find a real understanding of what type of team these are and who has an advantage in what areas of the game. So when looking at the season stats for these two teams, you can see why it was such a close race for second place in the Eastern Conference. They are very similar across the board in many stats, but there's a couple I'd like to highlight. When we look at offensive rebounds, you can see how Boston's ranked 6th in the NBA while Toronto's merely ranked 24th. This gives Boston extra opportunities to shoot field goals as they come down with more rebounds on the offensive end. For Toronto to have success in this series, you're really going to need the bigs such as Marc Gasol and Serge Ibaka to box out Boston's bigs, and then have your wings such as Pascal Siakam and OG Anunoby make sure that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are not picking up easy putbacks. The next place of interest is assists. Toronto was ranked almost a top 10 team with just over 25 assists a game. Meanwhile, Boston had 23 assists per game and were ranked a bottom 6 team in the NBA. So the styles are a little bit different here. Boston has a lot more players who can go one-on-one like Jason Tatum, Kemba Walker. They don't nearly pass the ball as much as other teams because they have guys who can create off the dribble. Toronto, on the other hand, really relies on ball movement, passing the ball, getting open shots. So a little bit of a different style here, something that you should definitely look out for when this series starts. The next piece I want to highlight is turnovers. Toronto was about league average with just under 15 turnovers a game. Boston, on the other hand, was just above league average, ranking 8th in the NBA with just under 14 turnovers a game. When you look at this along with their offensive rebounding edge, Boston might have some more opportunities to get more field goals or more free throws put up during the course of this series. Toronto's defense is going to have to step up and play very strong to make sure that they can have as many opportunities to get the ball back. When looking at shooting stats, the only real difference between these two teams is Toronto's proficiency from the three-point line. Toronto is vastly superior from the three-point area, averaging almost 14 three-pointers made per game at a very high clip of 37.5%. This puts them as a top 5 team in both categories, so for Toronto to be successful throughout this series, they're going to have to shoot a lot of threes and make them at a high percentage. The reason being Toronto is not actually as good around the rim as other teams. When looking at the Raptors' struggles to score at the rim, one way to counteract that is to have strong offensive rebounding. But, as mentioned before, this is an area where Toronto struggles. So, Toronto's going to really need to make their threes or really improve the game around the rim and hit those layups and find those dunks. When looking at the advanced ratings, you can see that Boston is a top 4 offensive and defensive team, which is extremely impressive. On the other hand, you have the Raptors, who are a top 2 defensive team and about a league average offensive team, with their rank being 13th. The net rating is essentially identical. This is looking at the difference between the offensive and the defensive rating. So on average, Toronto wins games by about 6.1 points, and Boston wins games by about 6.3 points. So dead even. So we've broken the series down in many different ways. Now here's my prediction. Raptors in 6. The reason I'm going with the Toronto Raptors in 6 games has a lot to do with Gordon Hayward being out of this series. Now, Gordon Hayward is a utility knife type player. He does a little bit of everything. He shoots, he scores, he drives to the rim, he rebounds, he can pass the ball, and losing that type of utility player really puts pressure on Marcus Smart now because he's put into the starting lineup, which really weakens their bench depth. Now, Toronto has a very deep bench, as I mentioned. We have 4 or 5 players that we can bring on at any time, and they can produce. So, as I mentioned, Toronto in 6. Let's get it, boys. If you like this content and want to see more, please like and subscribe below. Have yourselves an amazing day, and let's go Raptors.